here. We all know what this is like. So it starts to get cool. You can feel the weather change. There's that smell in the air. The leaves start to fall, and you know that it's that time, right? We're either going up north or we're going to the Thompson, and this is where we all disappear and break up with our boyfriends and girlfriends. It's the fall going into the early winter, and that's when we get to be a little wild and just disappear and dive into Steelhead.
Welcome to In the Bucket, the podcast that explores the culture of spey fishing in the Pacific Northwest, a spectacular land of mountains and wild rivers where every cast has a story to tell. I'm your host, Brian Niska. Hey, thank you for joining us today. We have a very informative show coming your way as I'm speaking with April Vokey from Anchored Outdoors, as well as Spey-O-Rama world champion speycaster Tim Arsenault. I've been friends with these two for many years, and it's been exciting to watch them thrive as respected professionals in the fly fishing industry. April has her own educational media company, including one of the best podcast shows in the outdoor space. Tim runs a fly shop in Vancouver, is highly sought after as a spey casting instructor, and has his own line company. Today we're going to talk high-level spey casting performance and gain some insight into the mindset of a successful steelheader. So yeah, lots to talk about. Let's get in the bucket. Welcome, everyone. I'm sitting here with April Vokey and Tim Arsenault. April, what can you tell our listeners about yourself?
Well, Brian, sorry. It's so funny because we go back so many years. And so I love hearing you be with your professional voice. I will also put mine on. My name is April Vokey, and I'm an avid angler who, as you know, started out my journey in British Columbia and now spent a significant time fishing in the Southern Hemisphere, Australia and New Zealand. And I am world traveled, and I'm probably just going to stop it there.
My name's Tim. I manage Michael and Young Fly Shop in Vancouver. I'm a line designer. I'm the North American rep and distributor for C&D rods and casting instructor. And I like casting competitions too. So that's another thing that I like to do. So that's me.
And the world casting, spey casting champion as of a few weeks ago. Woo, go Tim!
Buddy, you are so humble. Yeah, that was amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for sure. It's amazing to have finally got it done. It certainly has been a long road, but a rewarding one and an amazing learning journey. So it's and I'm looking forward to continuing that. So I'm really looking forward to 2025. But yeah, it took a long time, but it actually happened, which was pretty amazing for sure.
Tim, you're my hero. Really, I really mean it, and I'm being dead serious. I remember Blue Jeep, Tim?
Yeah.
Yes, Brian, you remember Blue Jeep, Tim? And then being on the Thompson, Tim's here. And then, because you don't want to fish behind Tim. And then going to Island 22 and knowing that you were down there and seeing black. I mean, this goes back decades now. And you have been going so hard for so long. And it's just been really cool to watch your journey. I really, really admire you. So,
well, I appreciate that, April. It's it's been a super long time and love casting, so it didn't feel like work really. It's been a passion for sure and a singular focus for me. And but no, I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet.
Well, Tim, let's take a moment here because not everybody's familiar with Spey-O-Rama. And let's do our very best to describe to people what Spey-O-Rama is all about. You probably know this, but I did actually attend the very first ever Spey-O-Rama. Yes. If my memory serves me, it was won by Ian Gordon. And one of the neat things about Spey-O-Rama is that with each year, the bar goes up a bit. So, casting technique and the technology and the equipment progresses with each Spey-O-Rama. So one would expect that when you defend your title next year, you're going to have to keep moving. So, the work is just starting, I suppose. So do your best right now to set the stage, describe to people how Spey-O-Rama works.
Yeah, so it's held at the Golden Gate Club. Angling and Casting Club, which is in Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. I don't know if you remember what year that was, Brian, that you went to the first one. Maybe 06 or 08 or something like that. I mean, it's going back for sure. I started going in 2011. That was my first year. But this club was built in the park, I believe, in the 50s. I don't know the exact date. or time, but I believe it was in the 50s. And there's basically 3 cement ponds that are set up for casting, and then a pretty amazing clubhouse on top of that. And essentially, you get 6 minutes to execute up to 12 casts. You've got 3 attempts at 4 casts equaling 12. So you have to do a left-hand snake roll, left-hand single spey, right-hand snake roll, right-hand single spey. You get 3 attempts at each, 6 minutes to complete if you need to complete all of them. And then they just sort of look at the highest score of each of those 3 attempts, and that'll count for your 1 cast. And then each one of them, they look at the longest one, and they total all 4 of them to come up with your score. Yeah, and I mean, it's essentially just a casting competition, a very difficult one, though, for sure. And you're deep weighted, still water, wide direction changes. It's an ambidextrous sort of thing too, which adds a lot of challenge to it. So it certainly has a lot of lore in the competition spey casting world, just from the difficulty of it. And it's a magical venue. April, you've been there. I remember you were there. Geez, was it 2017 you came?
Yeah, I was pregnant.
Yeah,
Yep.
I think it was 2017. And Brian, you spent several years there. So you guys both know the park's magical. It kind of, the smell of eucalyptus and the club itself, you kind of walk in, and it's a really neat place with a lot of history. And I think that really the difficulty of the competition and the sort of the iconicness of where it's held draws people from everywhere, from all over the world. So we usually get a really international turnout there. Most of the world's best casters tend to show up every year. So it's the bar, as Brian, as you were saying, the bar is always coming up, and every year it seems to get harder. I know my first 3 years there, I didn't make the finals. So there's elimination. In order to cast in the final, you have to make the top 10. And I think for me to make the top 10, it took 3 years. And the first year I got 14th. And the next year I went back and my score went up a bunch, but I got 14th again. And I kind of went like, oh man, like these guys are already way better than me and they're keep getting better. Like, I don't know how I'm going to catch up. And so it's a neat one. I don't know if that's the greatest description of, what it is, but a brief overview perhaps.
Well, while you were talking, I did look it up, and the first Spey-O-Rama was held in 2004.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And a gentleman named Jeff Pill made a DVD. That's how long ago it was. It was a DVD about it. And that DVD, I believe, came out in 2005.
I had that DVD.
Did
yes,
you?
Nice. Yeah.
I wanted to add one thing to your description. Yeah. So obviously this is a World Championships in a venue that is kind of stadium-like, framed by the eucalyptus trees with the beautiful grass lawn for people to watch in the clubhouse. But what's really neat about this event is you've got the best casters in the world, like yourself, and they're out there practicing. And it's a full week, really, of people casting. And just being there around it, you kind of learn just by the tempo of things and the sounds of things. But it's the access that's really neat. So Joe Bag of Donuts can wander into the park and come up to you and start getting, pro level tips from the best people in the world. And just, what other world championships gives you that much access to the competitors? Yeah,
I can't think of anything really. We talk to everybody. I mean, the club members, people that come to spectate. Yeah, it's pretty amazing. It's a pretty amazing place and a really amazing event for sure. Been a big part of my life for sure.
Now, April, you've attended, but you were pregnant. You didn't compete. Is that correct?
Yeah, I was never. I mean, I thought about competing, but I just didn't. Amy Hazel pulled me aside, actually, and she gave me a bit of advice. And she said, this is a lose-lose for you. Like, nothing good comes from you winning this or from you even attending this. And what could go wrong outweighs what can go right. If I were you, I would just avoid it. And I thought about it and opted to go that route. Plus, I just watched how many people I knew had devoted so many hours to just casting. And that was the big decision for me in the end, was I didn't want to sacrifice the time that I had fishing to do my casting. And I knew that I could do both, but if I really wanted to win the thing, I was going to have to focus on just casting. And then after I had a baby, and obviously was fishing with her on me and or didn't have as much time to fish, I just didn't want to sacrifice any hours to casting. I wanted to fish.
Yeah, I mean, I got to tell everyone, it's important to make the distinction. I'm someone who's a hack compared to the people who compete in the finals. And I've put some work in, but I'm in no danger of making the finals. So perhaps when I'm old enough, I'll go back for the Masters division or Seniors division, as they call it, I guess. But it's the amount of work that goes into it, isn't it, Tim? The hours before the competition. I mean, I suppose you could go down there with the plan that you're going to get better in the week leading up to the actual competition. But really, the work starts many months earlier. Do you think that you have a bit of a geographic advantage because you can literally cast year round in Vancouver versus, say, some of the Europeans who don't have that same level of access?
Yeah, I know Tommy and those guys will practice in the ocean because even when their lakes are frozen, typically they will have salt water. So I know Tommy and Vidar and some of those guys have a spot they call Spey Bay. And they go there and they practice. But I know like Karen Knight, for example, living up in Smithers, pretty tough. You know, the minimum amount of practice I can do and expect to have even a decent showing would be kind of every second day from New Year's until the competition. That's what I do, unless I get sick or the lake freezes over or something like that. And I know some people might be able to get away with less, but that's not the case for me. That's just what works for me. That's what it is. But yeah, I would imagine geography could make it difficult for sure. I know, Brian, where you're at, you've got ice a lot of the year. And then, for me too, I can't cast in the summer because my lake fills up with people everywhere and lily pads, and then there's a fecal warning on it. Like it's not a super pleasant place in the summer. For me, I guess I'm lucky living on the coast. And I have something close enough to me too that I can do it before work for an hour and a half before I go in. Yeah, so lucky there for sure.
So I remember casting with you and Tyler down there at your spot, and which is good reality check, humbling experience for someone like myself. But what I've learned from my practice is that there's kind of a sweet zone, and I can overdo it. I can go out there for too long. How long are your sessions? Typically an hour or so?
Yeah, you got to be careful because you can fatigue your mind as well as your body. So it's you can get tennis elbow from casting too much. That can obviously hurt. You can hurt your shoulders, all kinds of stuff. But sometimes your mind can get fatigued too if you go on too long and you start overthinking things. So yeah, I find like an hour that's focused, that has a plan to it and a structure to it that works for the person is a good way to go. But frequent short sessions is, I think, what works best for me.
April, question for you. Have you, you're in Australia, of course. Is there anyone in Australia who's talking about Spey-O-Rama or think about coming over for this? Has there been an Australian competitor other than Jamie Lee?
I don't think so. I know that it is getting interest. There's a couple of the guys who have the master casters trying to get their THCI. But no, as far as competition goes, I don't think so. And it is very hard to find somewhere to practice because I used to do some lessons down here and it was hard to find lagoons that, like you said, Tim, weren't polluted, especially in the Sydney region. I suppose you could do some stuff in the ocean. Hadn't thought about that. Yeah, access is tricky. And there's a little bit, it's interesting in Australia. There's a bit of this they call it tall poppy syndrome. Have you heard of that?
No.
I hadn't heard of it either, but it's this thing where, and I don't want to make it specific to fishing because it's with most things to do with success, where they'll say, oh, so-and-so has tall poppy syndrome. So say that you succeed in entrepreneur, for example, and then everybody is resent or they hate on you. They say that it's tall poppy syndrome. And I never really got it until being here. And to be fair, they're great with me. I have not had a single issue. Everyone's been great here. But I have watched people in various industries with fishing, hunting, even my husband, like even in engineering. If there's success or competition, there will be a general cloud of negativity. It's almost like it's really frowned upon in a lot of circles. and they call it tall poppy syndrome. So I don't know if a lot of Aussies want to compete, but again, that's just me speaking as a non-citizen alien or whatever they call me, looking in from outside.
So, Tim, are you able to talk about the equipment you use, or is it top secret?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. I've used a bunch of different stuff over the years. Bob Miser was the first person to sort of help me out with a rod, which was really, really cool. That started me on my journey. And then Steve Godshall, who works with Bob, made me a line, and I used that for a couple of years. And then Gene Oswald, who's Bruce and Walker North America, he had kind of said, here, try this rod. And it was a Bruce and Walker tournament caster, I think it was called. So I used that. And at that point, I had switched over to Karen head. And as you know, Brian, at that point, we were just taking that, like basically a fishing line, a Karen 95, 11, 12, and cutting it into a tournament head. And then the chief line designer at Karen started his own deal called Gale Force. James Chalmers, really good buddy of mine. And he came out with an amazing series of tournament lines that most of us started using pretty quickly, not long after that. And then when the C&D thing came around last year, I switched over to their stuff. And last year I used a C&D F1. And it was spectacular, a really great rod. And then this year, they came out with a new one called a C1. And I used that. 2 weeks before I got there, I got a new rod from them called the Bazooka.
Ooh.
The
Great
Bazooka,
name.
yeah. So I didn't have enough time to really get acquainted with that one, unfortunately. But it feels really, the name seems to be pretty accurate. So I'm looking forward to giving that one a shot when I get a chance, for sure. So it's tournament stuff though. Like everything is pretty much made for long distance casting. You don't see really any fishing rods there, or most people too. They're not like making their own heads or experimenting too much. There's a couple brands of lines that seem to be pretty popular and people use those. But for me, it's C&D and Gale Force at the moment. And really, really like that stuff.
So after I quit trying down there, I did get my hands on one of those Gale Force lines, and what a world of difference. That thing just wants to fly.
Yeah.
And is it still the same line, or is it changed?
No, there's been different iterations now. So James had the original, just the equalizer one, and they had a really soft coating that seemed to fly super, super well. And then he came out with, I guess, like maybe just pre-pandemic, he came out with 3 new ones. The Altitude, the Weapon, and the Beast, which was the last line that he made. And they had a slightly more durable coating on them, so that they've seemed to last a lot longer. But yeah, he seems to advance the taper for sure. Like they're amazing. In my mind, they're like the only thing I would use. I'm sure there's other stuff out there, but for me, James has always made my favorite tournament lines. I mean, all the way going from taking a fishing line like a Karen 95 and cutting it to his purpose-made heads. I've always been pretty loyal to his stuff. I think his stuff is really good.
Wow, I got a lot of questions for both of you all of a sudden, but I want to say that I really love casting the big stuff, and I think we can all take a quick moment of silence for not being able to fish the Thompson, because it is one of the few places where you can fish the big stuff.
True.
Fishing for Chinook with 15-foot 10 plus weights is also pretty cool. But April, one thing I've often wondered about, and you got to understand, I've never been down there, but Australia, you've got all these awesome fish in the ocean. Is there not a situation where you could get yourself out on one of those rocky points with a 17-foot rod and heave it out as far as you could and catch whatever's swimming by?
Yeah, we do it. I mean, it's easier said than done. Fishing on the rocks is the most dangerous sport down here. So you've got to be extremely careful that you're set far back. And the rocks have got this, it's almost like lava, right? Where we fish anyway, off the heads in New South Wales. So we're on the East Coast. And it catches everything. So you could do it with a basket. I know some of the guys, I think Brian Henderson has really fine-tuned this down here. And I think he might use a basket or even put a towel down. That would work. But then again, you've got an enormous embankment or rock, cliff face behind you. So you'd have to angle your back cast on an angle. I mean, it depends. Yes, it can all be done. But then you've got to deal with the wash. I know when I do the two-hand fishing off the beach, which obviously is a lot more open, I've got to time everything with the waves because everything goes slack for a bit there. You can do the roly-poly retrieve to really get your fly in fast, but you're just constantly battling waves. So short answer, yes, of course you can. But the rocks is going to be harder than on the beach, in my opinion. So for me, I put the rod under my armpit, and then I retrieve as fast as I can. And then when I get a strike, I just lift my arm out of my armpit and then use my body to set to the side and then start my fishing.
Awesome. Those must be awesome takes when something grabs it.
It's very exciting. Yeah.
So we're going to bounce around here a little bit, but Tim, Lizzie's my wife. Lizzie and I were talking about what's neat about the pairing of having you two both on the show at the same time is not only that, we've all known each other a long time and lived in generally the same area, but you've chosen to really do a deep dive in one really niche particular aspect of not just spey casting, but, tournament casting. April, you've gone a slightly different direction. You're a steelheader at heart, but your social media suggests that you spend as much time or more hunting and foraging these days. Is that true?
No. It probably looks like it. Yes and no. Look, I do a lot of hunting during the rut. So we're at the end of April. Thankfully, I was able to bring home a deer a couple of weeks ago. So now I can get my sanity back because I go a little off and a little feral every rut. Any other hunters may know what I'm talking about. I was talking about this recently. There's this psychological shift. And it used to happen with steelhead. You know how come specifically the Thompson here, we all know what this is like. So it starts to get cool. You can feel the weather change. There's that smell in the air. The leaves start to fall and you know that it's that time, right? We're either going up north or we're going to the Thompson. And this is where we all disappear and break up with our boyfriends and girlfriends. It's the fall going into the early winter. And that's when we get to be a little wild and just disappear and dive into steelhead. When we lost the Thompson, there was a little bit of mourning there. I know for me anyway. And I started to go up north. And it was at that time where I started to associate, because I'm a late hunter. I haven't been hunting my whole life. I grew up in a family of anti-hunters. So I would start to associate the same smells and the feel of, the cold air or the smell of the wood stoves or whatever it may be with animal scent as well or animal behavior. And so for me, the hunting was almost like an add-on to the fishing. So I don't want to dive into a big psychological piece here because nobody cares and we don't have time for it. But down here, because I don't have steelhead, I was able to keep that sort of culture and that sort of intimacy with nature with the hunting because they've got world-class hunting down here. The deer are feral. They're introduced. They want them gone. There's like 5 main species here that I'm quite fascinated with. And so I was able to enjoy the seasonal change, which is not as obvious here in Australia as it is in Canada, obviously. But I was able to still enjoy that shift and that kind of feeling of being alive with the fall, but had to do it in hunting. If they had steelhead here and a fishery here that was quite, as impressive as Canada, then I would have done it that way. But unfortunately, they just don't have it. Yeah. So, and foraging, look, that's just something I've always done. I've learned my hard lesson about posting that on social because everybody hates it. My following just plummets. There's like a number of things that I do where actually it seems like everything I do, my following plummets, but foraging plummets, hunting, I try not to post. I'll only ever do stories about it. That plummets. If I ever put on a dress, that plummets. If I post about my daughter, it plummets. So I just don't look anymore. I just can't look. But no. So yes, no, Brian. I do a lot of foraging and hunting, but I think just because we're coming off of the rut, it may look like I've been doing more hunting than I have fishing, but that's not necessarily the case. Long answer to a short question.
No, I mean, there's so many different aspects of the outdoors and one kind of leads to another. And, steelheading is not typically the gateway, but often it's where people end up. But, what's changed in my life is obviously having a bunch of kids. Whereas when I was living in Squamish and the river's right there and it's easy to go out all the time and, you have a lot of freedom that you don't realize you have until you have children. Now, if I go fishing on my own, that's pretty rare. Usually I'm, going with my kids or occasionally guiding. So a lot of times it's just, like you say, that it's almost really a primal thing. It's a migration to come north at that time of year and obviously the draw to the Thompson. And now a lot of the folks I know that Steelhead have got into hunting kind of late. A good example of that would be Darcy Baca, who was a guest on an earlier episode. I'm not sure if you guys know Darcy, but he's a photographer famous for shooting snowboarding, but now he's the principal photographer for Sims, and he is crazy about duck hunting.
Oh, did he?
He just got into
cool.
that.
I love Darcy.
Yeah.
Yeah, look, there's something about hunting that has a wonderful parallel with fishing. Do you hunt, Tim?
No, but it's something I've given some thought to for sure. In particular, duck hunting. I think that would be pretty awesome. Yeah, I mean, I would imagine that fly fishing to some degree is tied in with bird hunting in the fact that, you know, you'd kill a bird and then tie a fly out of the feathers and then catch a fish with that, right? So, I mean, our flies are made out of birds, right? So, I mean, yeah, and it just looks like a lot of fun. It looks pretty cool.
It is fun.
Kind of the same outfit too.
Pheasant hunting too, that looks pretty cool to me as well.
Pheasant hunting is very cool.
Yeah. That definitely looks like something that I would enjoy doing for sure.
But Brian, the hunting thing, I love hunting, but if I had the fishery here that you guys do there, I would choose that every day of the week. Don't get me wrong. I mean, I would never substitute the rut. Give me the prime 3 weeks of the rut any day. But, you know, I'm a little sensitive to the Australia thing. When you say things like, oh, as soon as we start talking about Australia, there's this little tiny thing in me that gets, I don't know if it's defensive or if it just kind of stands up a little bit, because I identify so much as a Canadian, and I have fought so hard to not live down here. You have no idea what goes on behind closed walls. I mean, that was the plan. The plan was we were going to live half the year in Canada, exactly half the year, and half the year there. And then, or here. And then COVID happened and everyone kind of got used to me here. And then our daughter started school. And unfortunately, until I can prove that education is better in Smithers than where she is now, I have to put her first. So I still spend 5 months a year in Canada, but it's not easy, as you can imagine. And I'll just leave it at that before I start crying on the episode. But I'm not actually going to cry. I've learned to really love it here. But Charles had a good point, you know, a few years back. He was like, you need to either embrace this and be happy again. There's no sense just crying, you know, not crying, but mourning Canada and not being able to be there. So embrace it and find what you love and dive all in. So that's what I've done. So I found the snowy mountains. I've started guiding again, which is very exciting, in the Blue Mountains, and then a little bit of hunting. And now I can finally say that I'm very happy. But if I had it my way, I would be back in my cabin on the Bulkley 365 days a year.
Well, you've got exceptional home water there in Telkwa.
Yeah, it's cool. Do you remember fishing that together, Brian? I had just had my car accident the year before. I was using my Watermaster to be able to support my bad foot. We were floating together. I think it was just us. Was it just us or was Yost with us?
We did a few floats, I think.
We were floating in the Elk Cross. Do you remember the Elk Cross? And you pointed out Denise Maxwell's house, and I was like, oh, I want that life so bad. And then we met up with Clint. Do you remember? And he was fishing the spoon down below.
Yeah.
It feels like a lifetime ago.
It does. You know, the first guiding I ever did in Skeena country was for the Maxwells on the Bulkley. And they hired me before I'd fished Skeena country. So I literally came up in, I think it was 98, 97, somewhere in there. I came up and living at Maxwell's house at the time, and walked down the hill and caught my first steelhead in the Bulkley in what is now your home run right in front of your place, and just was essentially slightly upstream at the bottom of their boat launch. And yeah, what a fantastic piece of property that is. You know, with the show In the Bucket, we do a companion website where I throw up some photos, and, you know, sometimes there's things we talk about that I can put on there. I have a really fun picture of you holding a giant knife from that float. So I'll see if I can find it and throw it up there.
Yeah, the one where I look psycho. Thank you so much, Internet. It's still there.
Yeah, that's a good one. I do have kind of a funny story. I don't know if you know this, but Scott Baker McGarva was a previous guest on In the Bucket, friend of ours from a long time ago.
Yeah.
And as you know, April, there was a time where I think Scott had a bit of a crush on you. I have a client with a tremendous sense of humor, Laurie from Grand Prairie. He's actually been talked about on the show a couple times, I think. And we got to the Dean, and at that point, you know, Scott had talked about you one too many times to Laurie. So Laurie had this idea, and he paid off someone who had an internet connection there, I forget who it was, to go and find a bunch of images of yourself from the internet, print them off, and then we cut them out. I kept Scott busy, and Lori went and hid them everywhere. He hid them in any place in the workshop, any place where Scott had to load his cooler. And so we had about 50 of these pictures spread around BC West, and Scott was finding them all season, just pictures of you holding fish.
You guys are mean.
Yeah, awesome. It was pretty hilarious. But, the reality is, April, your timing was exceptional. Obviously, you're exceptional, but your timing was exceptional in that you weren't the first famous female fly angler. I mean, there's lots of them previous to you, but you were becoming well known at a time when the internet was there to, help spread the word. And, obviously, you're very, very well spoken. You're the real deal. You've done a lot of fishing, and you're good at fishing, good at casting. And now it seems that there's a lot of female fly anglers. And for yourself, you've kind of keep evolving. You started out becoming well known for steelhead fishing, and now, anchored outdoors is a little broader subject matter. Can we talk a bit about, the TV show and, what you're doing with Anchored Outdoors and perhaps even where you see it going?
Yeah, look, I love having the podcast, which is where it started. Anchored Outdoors stemmed from Anchored. And for me, Anchored just came, speaking of timing, it came at the right time. I was unsure what I wanted to do in the fishing industry. I mean, I always know personally what I want to do. I want to be in moving water by myself, catching big fish. That's personally where I want to be. But professionally, I didn't know if I wanted to be where I was, which was in the public eye. It was starting to just be a little too much. And you're right, at the time. And Anchor did come way after the internet was established. Don't get me wrong. But it was starting to impact my fishing. People would approach me in situations or areas where I didn't necessarily want to be approached. The internet was cruel and unkind. Whether I deserved it for putting myself out there or not doesn't matter. It still really hurt. And I was thinking about, I found love. This was 12 years ago with Charles. I just didn't know if I wanted to be public anymore. And so I was wrapping up my television show and was actually getting pretty fired up with the edits, because someone like Lonnie Waller, for example, who was one of my first guests on the television show, which was called Shorelines, I had taped that interview and it was being edited down into just sound bites for television. And so to be able to take that whole interview and put it into a podcast, which is how Anchored started, was very rewarding. Just to know that his story was being shared in the length that it should. It was really disheartening to see someone who is trusting me to tell their story and know that this could very well be the last time he was telling his story in full. And we were breaking it up for sound bites, and clickbait, essentially. That was really hard for me and my integrity. That was not, it wasn't going to fly well with me. So decided to put it into a podcast format. And that's why Lonnie Waller was the first podcast episode. So from there, just speaking about not wanting to be in the industry or, being public, I realized I could be inspired by these people's stories. Every time I would leave a podcast episode, I would feel so inspired to be a better person, a better angler, more involved in the environment, whatever it may be. And so the podcast was really what got me invigorated about my career again. And then from there, just, grew naturally and organically. People want to see what we're talking about. So we started videoing, and then people want to learn by the best. So the masterclasses started. And long story short, Anchored Outdoors was formed.
Nice. And Tim, you have a masterclass coming up with April.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's going to be really fun. So Yay. Aaron and I we're really excited to do it. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, no, absolutely. Yeah, we're really excited about it. And I've recently looked through all of your stuff, and I think it's just awesome. And it's an honor to be part of it. And Aaron and I are really looking forward to doing that. So, yeah, I mean, what else can you say? It's a great platform you have. And I love that this stuff is educating folks. There's a lot of great content there. It's going to be really cool to be a part of all that, for sure.
Yeah. And Tim knows this, Brian. I'm just selfishly excited to learn, and to be able to really, learn at my own pace and pause and rewind. And Tim, I'm going to seem kind of like a crazy woman. I'll be watching you on pause in slow motion. Brian, I have a question. I need to swing this back on you for a second. And you have to excuse me. I have known you for a long time at this point now, and I've watched you go from flat brim Brian. Remember when everybody was so concerned about if someone's hat was flat or bent? The brim, I mean. I watched you going.
Yeah, now I don't have any hair.
I watched you go from partying rave Brian to now father of 4 children Brian to professional podcast host Brian. What was your plan? Because you're one of the smartest people I know. You scare me. You're so smart because you're so strategic. I'm always kind of on my toes with Brian, usually, because I never know what he's thinking because he just sits quietly and watches you, right? You know what I'm talking about, Tim. He just watches from afar. Brian, what was your plan? Because you had the fly shop and then you were making a name for yourself as an instructor and being a high profile angler. And then you took a step back. You started with the lodge. Did you plan all this out or did you just kind of follow your heart? And my final question and add on to that is, were you feeling the pressure of being in the public and wanting to take a step back as well? Or did you just naturally kind of take a step back? What's your journey?
Well, there's only so many hours in the day. Are you guys familiar with the story of One Red Paperclip?
No.
Nope.
Really? Oh, you got to look this up. So a girl I knew in Whistler actually has this paperclip. It's a red vinyl coated paperclip. Now, I wish I was better prepared. I'd be able to tell you the name of the guy who wrote the book, but the story goes like this. There's a gentleman, he had this paperclip, and he was going to make a series of trades. And I can't remember if it was 12 or 15, but it was no more than 15. And basically, every time he had the paperclip, he traded it up. So the first trade was with my friend, and if my memory serves, she traded him an alligator pen that she got somewhere on vacation. And his final trade was for a house. So he took this paperclip that he had and with a series of trades was able to come out with a house at the end. And I think the house was in Saskatchewan of all places, but it's a house. And so I kind of, that philosophy, and by the way, he wrote a book about this while he was doing it or after he did it. My philosophy is, whatever you have, right? So Tim, you're an exceptional caster. You work in the fly shop. You've got access to the best casters in the world. What can you turn that into? April, same thing to you. So for me, I also have this sort of thing where I kind of think your pathway's laid out in front of you. You just kind of got to pay attention to the signs, if you will. And, I spent 12 years in Whistler. That was fun. I spent a lot of time fishing around there and fishing in other places. And then when we came up here, that's kind of like a new chapter. And that new chapter is obviously raising kids, but then going, okay, well, what do I have? I've got, fishing lodge. I live on the river. I want to talk to people like yourselves who I know and have access to, who have interesting stories and lots of expertise, and share these conversations with whoever wants to listen. I mean, podcasting is funny, April, because everyone's a podcaster now, and there's so many people who have podcasts that are just like podcasting out into the universe, and who knows how many people are listening to it. Eventually, there's going to be more podcasters than listeners. But in this situation within the bucket, the idea was to do something slightly different. I didn't want to have kind of like a hangout podcast where we just talk about whatever's going on today. But I also didn't want to do interviews because, quite frankly, there's people who are way better at, like yourself, than me. I wanted to do this, what we're doing today. You get 2 or 3 people together, and sometimes it's a lot of fun. Like one of my favorite episodes so far was the last one, which was Dano and Darcy, because those guys have very similar stories. They're both professional snowboard photographers who don't do that anymore. They both love to fish, and now they're doing other things, and they've taken One Red Paperclip. They've taken their experience from snowboarding and now translated it into a different aspect of photography as a career. So what was fun about that episode is those guys had never actually met. So we had this great conversation. They have so many people in common, like EJack, and yet they've never actually met. So the first time they met was on the screen talking like we are now. And they had I think it's a great episode between the two of them. And at the end of it, they made plans to hang out and fish and do some photography together. So yeah, to me, that was a lot of fun. Speaking of EJack, I just want to bounce back for a second. Eric Jackson, professional snowboarder, huge steelhead fan. He just spent a couple of weeks with us here on the Skeena, loves to steelhead fish. But if you want to see him get excited, it's not about snowboarding as much as it is these days about elk hunting. That guy is a maniac for archery.
He is.
I don't think those elk stand a chance.
He did this last year before we left. And same thing. We went down a dark hole of archery talk. But that's what happens. And you will find that with a lot of us, is that once you get us started into bow hunting, it's hard to come back. It's just a whole different level. It's like all the great pieces about fly fishing, but on steroids, with the exception that you can't let it go after. I tell people I love hunting because I don't consider killing hunting. I love hunting and communicating with the animal, finding the animal, patterning the animal, tracking the animal, stalking the animal, all the things that we do with steelhead fishing. I hate killing. I appreciate the kill. I do it. I don't like it. And I love eating meat. So I'm stuck in a bit of an ethics sandwich or in a little bit of a sandwich there. But there are a lot of, especially with bow hunting, parallels with fly fishing. Even just the physics side of things, with a proper shot, the follow through, the loading and transition of energy when it comes to, drawing back on your bow. Trajectory, for example, velocity, all of the things that we do with fly fishing. Broadheads, you can almost liken that to a fly on the end of your line. There's a lot of parallels there. So it's kind of fun for me and not relaxing, but it's rewarding or necessary to go from fly fishing season and steelhead season into hunting season, because then you can kind of keep it going. Because let me throw this back at you guys. What do you do? November, the rivers freeze up. What do you do? Do you go through that grieving process where you're like, oh dear, now it's over? And I sit and wait. We used to just go to the Thompson. I guess now you can go to the Chilliwack. What do you do November, December, January?
Me?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'll look for early winter steelhead. Yeah. The Chilliwack's a pretty busy river, as you both know. But early December is actually it's gotten busier over the years, but it's still a pretty quiet time. There's definitely some rivers out there that do get some fish around that time. I've really fallen in love with like you would say, you love the hunting, not the killing. Mm-hmm. For me, it's the fishing, not necessarily the catching. So I place a really high value on casting and hanging out with friends and drifting on cool rivers. And those things, if I can have those things, the day is already a success. But yeah, we're lucky down here that if you're willing to do a little bit of travel, there's always something to do. There's always somewhere, although it might not be prime, there's always a chance of running into an early fish. And just being down on the coast, we just don't get the freeze up. So yeah. And it's funny, really when you fish locally for winter steelhead with a fly, a really good season is just a handful of fish. And there's a lot of days without fish. That's for sure. So in that respect, really a day anywhere early where you don't catch anything, it's really not that different than right in the middle of the season when there's, more fish around. But most times you're not necessarily catching fish. So I love fishing. I love the ritual of fishing. I love, in particular, steelhead fishing. What I love about steelhead fishing, it's more that the fish are amazing. They're so interesting. All the different the seasonality of the runs, certain rivers having small fish, other rivers having big fish. It's really, really cool. But then there's the old reels, like, you're fishing stuff from pre-World War I. There's 17-foot rods, 16-foot rods. There's these lines that are 60, 70, 80, 90-foot head lengths. And it is just such a neat way to fish. And then you pile all the history, on top of that. And it's just, I never really mourn because I'm just like, I'll just go fish. Like I'll just go fish somewhere. Right. And, obviously, places like the Thompson, obviously for everyone to lose a place like that, is a big, big old hole. But yeah, in late fall, you do have some early steelhead kind of pulling into some of those systems. And I know in the Chilliwack, oftentimes the first fish you'll hear of will be some guy fishing for coho late in the season and end up with one. And there always seems to be a couple around for sure. Yeah. So that's what I do. Brian, I know you guys freeze up. So I don't know, can you go further to the coast and have opportunities, or is it pretty...
Well, one of the main difference between Smithers and Terrace is the length of the winter.
Right.
And in Terrace, we can literally be above freezing any month of the year, though we can get, minus 25. It does happen usually a few times a year. But, there are rivers. So to generalize on the Skeena, you've got summer runs and you got winter runs. We put them in these two boxes. And the summer run fishery typically starts in mid-July. and goes through till, let's call it November. But the peak of it would be, say, August and September. The winter run fishery just kind of starts the next day, whenever that next day is. But, if a fish arrives in February, we say that's a winter run. The summer run fish is in the summer. But those fish that we catch on a warm day in December that are chrome bright, what are you going to call them? I mean, they're all going to spawn in the spring. But, a good way to think of it is the accepted rule is that if you're below Kitwanga, there's winter fish down there. If you're above Kitwanga, those are going to all be summer runs. So the lower tributaries of the Skeena, specifically say the Copper, the Kalem, some of the other ones, they have fish that are both types. And there's not really a long period throughout the year when you don't have fresh fish coming in. So as an example, let's say the Kalem, just for fun, you get fresh fish there in November, December, January, February, March, April. Obviously, those ones coming in there aren't in there for long before they're going to spawn. And that's the beauty of the Skeena, is just the diversity of the run timing, the different characteristics of the various tributaries, the different life histories of the fish. Your average Skeena steelhead returns as a 6-year-old fish, but you do have fish that are younger, fish that are older. And, from one year to the next, I think water conditions matter more for angling success than the overall size of the run. I don't think our winter fishery is, I think it's like down on the South Coast. You don't have huge numbers of winter steelhead. So they're all special, Tim, like you say. And if an angler is out there every day because their work situation and their home life situation allows that, they're going to run into a bunch of fish. If someone works Monday to Friday and they fish a couple days a week, well, hopefully they hit some good conditions and that's how it goes. But, I don't think there's huge numbers of winter steelhead anywhere. And I'm not convinced there really was, because part of the secret sauce for wild steelhead is having good rearing habitat. With good rearing habitat, so then you're sending out the best quality smolts to an ocean where we have no control over the return rate that we're going to see. Some years you have La Nina and some years you have El Nino, and you factor in Pacific Decadal Oscillation and whatever type of interception is taking place, and you get what you get. But the beauty of steelhead is you don't need a lot of them to have good fishing. And one of the really neat things about steelhead, so I'm going to use an example here on the Skeena. So 1998 was the best return we've ever had. Escapement was just over 60,000 fish, which by standards south of the border doesn't sound like a lot of fish, but for up here, that's tons. Most years, Skeena has around 30. And thinking what I said earlier about your average Skeena steelhead being 6 years old, that means that fish that came back in, say, 91, 92, 93 played a major role in the production of that large run with fish in exceptional condition. However, those years were all very low return years. So there's something to this idea that a low returning number of fish will produce, their progeny will fare exceptionally well because they'll have the best access to habitat and groceries and produce the highest quality smolts, which are then better suited to survive in ocean conditions. And, talking to people, talked to Bob Hooton a couple of weeks ago about this. He had a front row seat for 1998. And what was exceptional that year wasn't just the size of the run, but the condition of the fish. And anyone who's flown into the Smithers Airport has seen those two giant steelhead there. Both those fish were caught in the same test fishery on the same day. So, wow, what a time to be alive that was, right?
Oh, wow.
So jumping around here for a second, Tim, I want to go back to fly lines.
Yeah.
You're a humble guy. We should have talked about this right at the beginning, but what I remember from casting with you is you're always trying to get better, and that includes the equipment. And you're a bit of a line mechanic that way, and I think the logical outcome of that was bridge. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about your line company?
Yeah. It just came, it kind of came from tournament casting, because in tournament casting, to start off with, we were kind of using fishing lines and cutting them into tournament heads. So there was some messing around with lines. I think that's where I started kind of cutting and messing around with stuff a little bit. But even today, the tournament lines that are out there, you cut them to fit. So you're not necessarily changing a tape or anything, but you're adjusting sort of the thick level back part of the line to fall into an acceptable grain weight for whatever rod you're using, or even just how you like the line to feel, or how you like your rod to feel, or a length that you're comfortable with. But basically, early in doing that kind of got me interested in fly lines, gave me a reason to, wonder why they work the way they did. And then when I started tournament casting with that gear, I immediately felt a level of speed and power in the lines that I hadn't felt in other stuff before. And as the years wore on, it really got me thinking about how much fun it is to cast stuff like that. And if perhaps there could be some fishing lines that would be, similar in feel or inspired by the same ideas behind some of the things that would make a line feel that way. So that's it. It all came from a pretty genuine just interest in how lines work, which is something I still don't totally understand. I'm learning. I'm certainly learning. It never stops. There's a lot of times I create something on an Excel graph that I think is going to be amazing, and then I put it together and I go out and I go, wow, well, that didn't work at all. So there's a lot of experimentation. And it seems to be like a never-ending road for sure, but super rewarding and fun. Yeah, and I think that's where it started. That's where it came from. I think when I kind of got the idea to that you could have fishing lines that would feel similar. I remember Travis Johnson, who both of you know, who's been a big, obviously been someone that I've looked up to in my tournament casting career. He had said to me, because I kind of pushed the question to him, like, hey, well, what do you fish? Like, and he was like, well, I fish this Winston 13-foot 3-inch 7-weight rod, and I get a Karen 8.965, and I cut into the back of it just like we do our tournament heads until I get like a head that fits that rod. And it's kind of like this mini tournament setup for summer run fishing. And so then I had a 13-foot 7-weight miser, and I tuned this head for it. And I think that's really what got me going. I was kind of like, wow, this is like a mini tournament thing. Like, this is really cool. And the line was shorter, but the rod was shorter. So the line length to rod length ratio, it was a little less, but it felt similar. And then that really got me thinking like, oh, wow. And then, James Reed, who I'm sure both you know as well, he was the first person to sort of, I told him about my interest in doing that, and he kind of said to me, well, do you know how to quantify that? Because without seeing a line on a graph and understanding shape, you're going to have a hard time, making something like that. So he took a lot of time out of his busy schedule to meet up with me, and we took calipers to lines and we graphed them and we looked at the shapes. And the more that I did that, the more I started to see that a lot of the lines I liked had particular features. Yeah. And, common terminating diameters in the front for particular payloads, common diameters in the back and the thick part that are making up the majority of the grains per foot to make a line the particular grain weight it needs to be for a particular purpose and length. And yeah, it all just went from there, and it's just continued. It continues to be a super rewarding, fun, challenging thing, and super amazing to hear or see other people actually using stuff you made and enjoying it, which is certainly something I wasn't always super sure I could make something that someone else would like. So it's really neat now that there's some lines out there, getting pictures from people on Instagram, like, hey, I caught this fish on this line, or, that kind of stuff. And especially when it's places I've never been, because I've always wanted to go to like Tierra del Fuego or whatever. And it's always crazy to see someone catch like a sea run brown on one of my lines. And then I'm like, well, I'm not there, but like, that's like the next best thing, I guess. So you get to vicariously experience a little bit of that. But that's where that's, I guess, the story of why it started, and it just seems to continue to grow. It's been really, really amazing to see the growth of it, and it just continues to go, which is amazing.
Nice. I got to tell you, we see a lot of them up here on the Skeena.
Wow, it's amazing to hear that.
Are you going to be diving into single hand stuff as well?
I mean, my passion is spey casting. And I have a hard time veering away from it, but I love single hand casting too. I think that could definitely be in the future. I would put it that way. But at the moment, I'm still nose deep in a lake of questions about spey line design and uses and all that stuff. So I typically just follow my heart and see where it goes. And if the path leads that way, then we're gonna get there for sure. But at the moment, my obsession is spey casting and spey lines, and so that's just where it's at for the moment.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
From a business standpoint, it's such a niche market where, April, you've got such a good head for business. I know that question was coming. You think of what percentage of the overall fly fishing market is single hand versus spey, and then within that spey market, how much of it would be people that want to fish longer lines? What's the problem with longer lines is, well, you have to be a decent caster. You can get away with a lot with shorter stuff. And one thing I love to do, my staff might hear this, but one thing I love to do with new guides is take them down to our casting dock. We're situated on a back channel with no current, and I've got a little casting dock there. Now, if you want to feel really good about your long belly casting, you stand on a dock. You don't go wade 3 feet deep in the water, and there's really no such thing as bad wind. But yeah, if you stand on the dock, you can get some pretty good distance. But I love to get the new guides and hand them a comp type setup and say, here, let's see a cast, because it all comes out with the long stuff. There's no faking it. And I think if you can cast the long stuff well, everything else is just a slightly tuned down version of that. So thinking, Tim, now about the single hand stuff, the logical move perhaps could be, getting folks spey casting with their single hand rods and, doing up special lines for that, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I think so. That's definitely something that I would look at for sure when we get there. I also want to make some dedicated trout stuff too. There's certainly a lot of people in the middle of the United States and Canada that really enjoy their trout fishing, and they migrate to the coast to fish for anadromous species. But then when they go home, they want to have that sort of classic steelheading experience, but in their own home fisheries. And I've had a lot of people ask me about doing a longer style trout head where you could use a trout spey and have, something in the 10.5 to maybe 12-foot range as far as the length of the rod goes, and a 2, a 3, a 4, or a 5 weight. But then having a head that's in the 45, 46-foot range, maybe 40-foot range, that would provide you with a classic long belly experience with a shorter trout style rod. So that's something that a lot of folks have asked for. And then my torrent head, which is my Skagit-ish sort of head that I came out with, it is a little bit longer than your typical Skagit. So doing something similar in that vein for trout too would be really neat. Yeah, and the company has really just been about trying to promote the joy of casting more than anything. And it's certainly, I know for me, that's what keeps me fishing in lean years, or like you said, like early season, there's not a lot of fish around. And we just really want people to really enjoy casting, enjoy the challenge, embrace the challenge. Nobody picks fly fishing for steelhead because it's easier or you're going to catch more. We all pick it because it's more challenging. And so for me, what I always try and get, what I like to push is, when you get good with that casting system that you're using, step out of your box and try something different and learn something new, right? And that can, a lot of people kind of get down on Skagit lines, but for me, someone coming from gear fishing and picking up a Skagit line is stepping outside of their box as much as someone who's fished a Skagit line that's switching to a mid-belly line. So I just have I think it's really cool to continue to challenge yourself. And I want to make products that allow that to happen across a broad spectrum of different fisheries. And that's sort of where we go. But yeah, I do think single hand spey lines would be super cool. That's for sure.
It's funny hearing you say that about Skagit, because I would say Skagit is 90% of what I fish.
Sure.
But I cast my Skagit the exact same way I cast my long belly, only with smaller movements. But technique's still the same. And I get a bit of a kick out of people who talk about Skagit, and meanwhile they're casting they can cast a Skagit, and maybe that's what they hate about it. But then when they take something longer, they just can't make it work properly. But yet they somehow think there's a problem with Skagit, and they want to start with long belly.
Yes.
And you kind of start with what you can handle and focus on anchor placement, focus on keeping slack out of the line system. Work on creating a really nice D loop. Talk about trajectory. I'm starting to sound like an archer here for a second, April, but power application is a big part of it, regardless of how long the line is. And I sometimes summarize it, Tim, when people say, "What do you do? You teach casting?" Well, was teaching casting was telling people to slow down. But why are people adding speed too soon? And it's because they feel load leaving the rod. So if you can't keep load within the rod, it's kind of pointless to keep adding difficulty to it. So, looking at that journey to go to Spey-O-Rama, and the neat thing, I'm coming back to Spey-O-Rama for a second. The neat thing about Spey-O-Rama is anybody can go and sign up. There's no qualification to get into the actual competition. You have to qualify to get to the finals, but anyone can go and participate and cast alongside people like yourselves. And it's a great way to give yourself a pretty good idea of, you got a lot of work to do. And someone like yourself who is currently at the top of the game understands that there's progression. That first Spey-O-Rama, if I remember correctly, the longest cast was about 150 feet. Are people throwing over 2 now?
They're getting there. They're getting close. I think Travis, a few years back, threw, I want to say 198. And then in the world championships that happened in Europe, I think Geir Hansen holds the 18 and the 15-foot records right now. And the 15, I think, I'm not going to get this right, but it's just a ballpark. I think it's about 215. So yeah, 200. I think at the club, I don't know, how would I say this? The way the wind is at the club and the venue, it's really tough to get into that upper 190 class. I don't know. I guess maybe I shouldn't say that. It's rare to see it anywhere, really. But yeah, club record is 198. Geir, I think, I can't remember where they were holding it that year, somewhere in not Norway, but somewhere in Europe. I think he did 215. And then the 18-foot record's it's over 250 anyway. It's a long one for sure. So, yeah,
it's a lot of stripping.
Yeah, So I mean, and to qualify this year for the final, I think 635 was the marker. So I think I think in 2019 we saw a similar bar. So when I first started going, again, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I think around 550 to 600 would be the marker back then. But, even just saying those first 3 years I went where my score went up, but my place didn't move, that was a really good thing for me to see. That's that bar is just coming up. And so if you're going to hope to, you're getting better, but the guys who are already better than you, they're getting better too. So it's, you start going, how am I going to catch up here? This is going to be difficult, right?
Can I ask a question just on the Skagit thing real quick?
Yeah.
Is there a length of line where your stroke introduces a different characteristic? Let me explain. Short line, short stroke, right? Single hand, double hand. So like you said, Brian, the Skagit stroke is going to be the same as, say, maybe a mid-belly line. But when you start getting real long, are you introducing anything in particular? You still kind of drift a little in Skagit. You don't have to, but you could. Do you introduce a totally different movement with your driving hand? Is there any characteristic or any sort of movement that you add in, say, a long belly line versus a Skagit line? Or is it just truly an exaggerated movement or a longer movement as to what you do with a short line?
I'll let you go first, Brian. You go ahead.
So for myself, I primarily fish single spays and snake rolls with my Skagit. Those are the two casts I use the most, for the simple reason that they're quick. They're very efficient to get the fly back out there. Now, there are still people in this world who believe that you can't do a touch and go anchor cast with a Skagit, but they're wrong. Yeah. You can. It works really well. The mechanics are the same, but here's the difference. If I had Tim set up and I was trying to not embarrass myself, I would do a really good job of getting my hands up and drifting back. And my forward stroke would be the full effect of my body rock and my really long arms. When I'm fishing with my Skagit, I keep my hands a lot lower where they're less likely to cause my shoulders any type of issue. I do drift back a little bit, but I don't use as much body rock, not even close. My forward stroke, however, is a fairly full, long forward stroke, and I tend to accelerate up because it's that path of acceleration that helps determine your loop shape and your trajectory. And I tend to kind of follow through a little bit at the end. It surprises people because a lot of times they'll say, hey, you cast your rod tip almost down to the water. And the reason I do that is two things. One, it lets the line shoot out through the rings better. And two, as it comes down, it applies just a little bit of resistance, which helps the loop fly nice. And in my view, a good cast, one of the hallmarks of a good cast is as it's turning over, it wants to climb. And applying just that little bit of resistance at the end of the stroke helps enable that.
Yeah, I like all that stuff. I think for me, the longer I've done this, I think when I first started spey casting, it was an interesting time because all these task-specific rods were coming out. So like the greased line series, like the Loomis series where there was the Stinger, the Dredger, the long belly, there was all these like, and people were running around saying, oh, you can't cast that like this. And this, if you're going to cast this, it has to be like that. And there was this, you're not underhand casting because you're not doing that. And it was this, like, when I first started, there was a lot of separation. No, you can't do that with that. And this isn't but as my time in spey casting has increased, I see way more similarities than I see separation. And I essentially do all the same things in short line casting that I do in a long line cast. But I will make small alterations, as Brian said. I will raise my hands a little higher if I'm fishing a longer head, in particular if I'm weighted deep. You know, I'm conscious that my D-loop has to fit between the space that is dictated by the water surface and the rod tip. And as I wade deeper, that's going to decrease. And I'm going to need to compensate by bringing my arms up. I think I'll use a longer forward stroke with a long line, the same way if you're single hand casting and you have a very small amount of line out, you can have a very short stroke. But if you're carrying 50 or 60 feet of line, it's very difficult to do this. You're probably going to want to apply tension to the line for a longer period of time. So I will generally make those changes, but my firing position essentially stays the same. It just might go from shoulder level to maybe just above eye level or just maybe slightly above my head. With a shorter line, I may have the option to stop right here, but I know with a longer line, if I want it to turn at distance, I'll probably need to push a little further. But as Brian said, I generally use a pretty full stroke now for everything, like a longer stroke, because I believe that it's easier to smoothly and linearly accelerate through the casting stroke over a longer path than a shorter path. So yeah, and one thing I've said quite a bit is that I don't think long lines are harder to cast than short lines. I just think they're less tolerant of casting errors. So all the same fundamentals that make a long line work, they apply to a short line as well. It's just that if you do have some inefficiencies in your stroke, the shorter line will tend to, you might be able to get away with a few things that you wouldn't with a longer line. So for me, the longer a line gets, it becomes like a magnifying glass for casting inefficiencies and things that maybe don't matter as much with an OPST commando head, for example, could completely murder a cast that has a head length that's 65 feet, right? So, but to me, I always try and go fundamental on it. And usually if I present if I get the opportunity to present at an event, like a spey casting event, I love to do a demo that just kind of says like, it's awesome. Everyone came out for this. You guys are going to get a chance to try so many different things today. There's going to be short lines, long lines, short rods, single hand rods with spey lines on them. There's going to be all these different things, but let me show you the fundamentals of spey casting that are going to work all the way across all these spectrums. So all of you can go out and have a better day today trying this stuff, no matter what the length and length of the rod, weight, whatever it is. And I typically do that demo with a 16-foot 11 weight and as long a line as I can to show people that even at the extreme, like it's a small tree of a rod, but to show people even at the extreme end of this, these are the basics of where an anchor should land. And, people tell you can't snap T a 70-foot head, but if you get the anchor in the right place and you have a great sweep and a great firing position and good alignment, you can parry poke a 70-foot head. You can snap T a 70-foot head. You can snake roll a Skagit head. Who thought they could ever do that? Or single spay with a Skagit head. But for me, fundamentals are key. And I think anytime that you're using a system that's moving outside of that middle ground, they're just small alterations on what is already, to me, fundamental. And so as time's gone on, as I said, early on, it was just like a mess of so many different ideas and things. But then as time's gone on, I've really seen more of a unified sort of idea behind spey casting for me.
Tim, you're always one with great analogies, and I've certainly stolen a few of yours over the years. But one thing I've heard you say a few times, which I think is a great explanation, is you talk about the early days of mixed martial arts, UFC. And
totally.
Why don't you go ahead and share that with people? Because that's a good comparison.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of exactly it. Like when we were young, I remember being like 16 and like UFC 1 came out. And my friends were like, oh, you got to come over and see this. We rented this thing and like these guys are fighting and there's no rules. And, as a young man, you're like, oh yeah, it sounds great, right? So you go over and, I'm watching this thing. There's no weight classes. There's some guy with one bare fist on one hand, a boxing glove on the other. There's all these like weird types of martial arts that I've never seen before. And to me, my early time in spey casting was like that. There was all these crazy ideas floating around about different, methods and ideas. And then the same thing was at, early Spey-O-Rama, looking at the different setups. People were fishing like really long stuff. And then I think in 2006 or 7, Scott O'Donnell and Simon Gosworth showed up with essentially Skagit heads. And there was like all this different stuff going on from every different style. You had guys underhand casting, all kinds of stuff. And then as time went on in UFC, they kind of figured out, no, it's kind of jiu-jitsu, wrestling and kickboxing. And a combination of those three makes you like a really well-rounded fighter. And of course, today you've got people training from the very beginning of their martial arts career in this trilogy, this sort of triangle of different things. And it's funny. It's for me, it's spey casting. In my mind, in the beginning, all these different things, it was like all these ideas floating around and all this crazy stuff going on. And then as my time went on, as the decades rolled past, and I was exposed to so many techniques and people's ideas and things, and it narrowed and narrowed and narrowed until I kind of saw, for me and how I teach, more of a unified, exactly that, a unified idea behind what makes spey casting good. Just to expand on that, a big part of that was Travis Johnson came up to teach some lessons for the shop. And I said to him, hey man, like what kind of lesson do you want to do? Like, and he was like, oh, what do you mean? And I was like, well, you're a long belly casting champion. Do you want guys just having those lines? Is this like a long belly lesson? Or like, did you want to do Skagit because maybe more people would want to do that? And he was like, no, I just teach spey casting. And I was like, so you're cool with like everyone showing up with different stuff, like everything from switch rods to, yeah, that's totally fine, right? And I assisted him and I watched him teach 15 people with all different kinds of stuff, how to spey cast. And to me, that was a big, like witnessing that to me was like a huge, it really helped me kind of put together in my mind that there's not a lot of difference between those things. There's small alterations, but they're not as big as I necessarily thought they were at times.
April, I know you teach some casting as well. And one of the challenges for a new casting instructor is they try and inflict their will on anybody. And when someone pays you good money to help them cast better, regardless of whether we're talking single hand or spey, they typically would show up with the rig that they're going to fish. And sometimes the shop that sold it to them didn't do the best job setting it up. It doesn't balance that well. And I always have this kind of internal struggle where, do I let them cast this janky setup long enough that it really screws them up? Or do I put something balanced in their hand as quick as possible and then give them back their janky setup so they can feel the difference? Or do I just work with what they have? Because you can make anything work, but you're going to have to compensate in ways that aren't necessarily good for your overall development as a caster. April, I'll start with you, and then Tim, what's your philosophy when someone shows up with a setup that you just can't stand?
I just get straight to it, and I put a decent setup in their hands. And then I can at least say, this is how it can feel. Now let's talk about how yours feels and maybe why. And is there an affordable way to fix that? And depending, I do a lot more handed casting and lessons these days than the two-hand side of things. So I'm speaking specifically to single-hand casting. It's usually just as easy as switching the line out. Sometimes the lines are just ancient, so it's easy to fix that. The rods are usually not so bad.
I agree. That's what I do too. I bring one of my own setups to every single lesson, usually just in case a rod breaks, so we don't have to stop the lesson. But if it's not lined properly, I think you're 100% there, April. For me, is like, I just hand them something good. I go, hey, these are the reasons why this isn't working. These are the reasons why this is going to be better. And just so you know, it can be fixed. And if you need to fix it, I would just recommend it. And as you said too, most of the rods are good and the lines are good too. It's rod line combinations that don't always work when they're not put together properly. So yeah, generally I just find for me, it impacts as you said, compensating in ways that perhaps aren't super great for casting. So I just go, hey, use this. Yeah. And we go from there.
I have a question that I've been wanting to ask somebody advanced for ages. And actually, I probably should have asked my last podcast guest, who is Mac Brown. He's just this amazing casting guy when it comes to single-hand casting. But you two, I'm going to ask you this. Over the last probably 10 years, I've been really experimenting, again, single-hand casting with my hands. Now, I've got very strong hands for women. They used to make fun of me for, having man hands, but I've learned to really love having strong, muscular, big hands. And I really focus on when I contract certain muscles in my hands, specifically this bottom bit, as well as on my follow through, rolling my muscles, essentially starting contracting with my pinky finger into this real meaty part of my hand down here. What would you call this? Kind of the outer edge of my palm, I guess.
Heel, maybe.
Heel of my hand. And then contracting my muscles straight through into my delivery as I'm rotating. Do you guys do any of this? Am I the only psycho who does this? Do we do it in spay casting? Talk to me.
Okay. For me, I mean, I know in single hand casting, sometimes I believe they call it translation, or some people call it rotation, when the rod rotates forward and the wrist turns over. In single hand casting, I've never focused. It's really cool, actually. I've never thought about essentially, like what I'm hearing is kind of like when I'm spay casting, I pull in with my lower hand and I push out with my top hand. And it sounds to me like that's what you're doing with your single hand, is you're pulling in with your lower fingers and pushing out with your thumb. So to me, that makes all kinds of sense, because that's a super important part of spay casting. And certainly anyone who's advanced in single hand casting, when I'm teaching them, of course, when you first start teaching someone they never spay cast before, oftentimes I discourage the use of overt use of the wrist, because people will start the windshield wiper kind of thing. But of course, for really advanced single-handed casting, your thumb's traveling along that line, that straight line. And then as you turn it over, you're continuing to travel that straight line. People have a tendency to kind of come straight down off of it. But it's the same thing in spay casting. When you're coming forward, and you're pulling under, and you kind of want to finish with a full rotation where your lower hand's ending up under your top arm. And to me, it just sounds like, I've never thought about it in the idea of a push and pull with a single hand.
Just with fingers, wrist not included. And same with, if I were to bring it to you, Tim, and Brian, I know you'll have some thoughts on the single hand side of things, but what about your bottom hand? Do you squeeze with your bottom hand? You know how sometimes you can squeeze and relax just to even help to encourage a drift with a newbie. With your bottom hand, do you squeeze at any point and then relax? Or does it stay the same pressure all the way through?
Now I'm trying to think. I never actually paid attention to that before. I think I squeeze. If I'm just going through it now, I feel like when I'm moving forward, I squeeze. And when I stop, I think I relax.
Right.
I think that's what happens. That just paying attention for the first time, that it feels like that's probably what I do. But would you say it's kind of a push and pull with your hand, like actually your hand, like you're rolling your muscle?
Literally what I'm doing here. It's literally that. Brian, have you ever had a look at that? Just that slight extra, just on the final delivery. So I've already technically done well, I guess it would have to be during my rotation. It would have to be, but it's almost like a tiny little bit extra load even. What about you, Brian? What are your thoughts on that?
So this is exactly the type of conversations that I want to have within the bucket, but they're challenging because for people listening, they can't see the hand motions that we're doing here, and explaining casting, to someone over the phone is obviously hard too. So I love where you're going with this, April. And I want to say that I have this philosophy that the rod knows how to cast, and we just need to get out of the way and let the rod do the work. And what I try and do as much as possible is have my top hand kind of float. I play a fair amount of hockey these days, and I kind of came to that late in life. And what I've learned is that shooting right, my left hand does a lot of the work with stick handling. And spey casting, my left hand has a pretty good grip on the bottom of the rod. My right hand just kind of floats. And, loving a good analogy, you try different stuff with students and sometimes they click. One of the ones I try a lot is describe a basketball free throw. So my top hand is kind of just pushing through. It's not really doing much for controlling the actual cast. It's the bottom hand that's going to do that. The top hand is just kind of floating. It's a real loose grip, because I find that initially people tend to want to grab the rod too hard. This is both single hand and spey, of course. And when they grab it too hard, they tend to get in the way of the rod wanting to load and unload, especially unload. And, they end up hitting it downward. Whereas if you are pushing on it, it's a lot easier to get that trajectory we're looking for angled up. One thing I will do teaching single hand, and I haven't done a lot of single hand instruction lately, is I'll talk to people about letting the rod kind of float and then pushing with their thumb and kind of pulling back with their pinky, kind of like what you're describing, April.
Exactly.
And I love what Tim got onto there with, he was saying, hey, what you're doing in a really micro kind of way is the same thing we're doing with two hands.
It's just with
right?
one. Yeah.
And then, sometimes people talk about the timing of a double haul. And I'll go back to Mike Maxwell for a second, because he really was ahead of his time. And I remember asking Mike, how do you explain the timing of a double haul? Because that's tough. And he would say, I would get people to haul in anticipation of the stop, right? And, it's kind of something that just happens naturally as the one hand overtakes the other. But to me, the timing of a double haul is very similar to the timing of the power application when I'm two-handing and I'm using my bottom hand. And, you explain to students, everyone wants to cast with their bottom hand because they've heard that that's what they're supposed to do. But being able to have an effect with your bottom hand is actually a result of doing everything right. And if you try and apply too much power too soon and you bump your bottom hand, you're going to end up with a tailing loop, right? Best way to demonstrate a tailing loop for anyone listening, if you want to show someone a tailing loop, is hit it really hard with your bottom hand early. You'll throw a heck of a tailing loop. But yeah, it's another analogy could be, I don't know if people still do this, but driving standard, letting the clutch out and applying a little bit of gas. And, the two hands work together. And April, what I'm hearing from you is this idea of, just even how you're applying power within your hand. And, it starts with the top and the thumb being up and finishes with the pinky at the bottom. And you're not really having a hard grip on the rod. The rod's just kind of floating, but it's controlled there. I'm going to use another Maxwell thing real quick and then I'll shut up. But when I first started working for Mike Maxwell, and he was a real innovator, and he had these rod holders in the boat. Now we use Scotties, but he had these homemade rod holders in the boat, and the clients would look at them and say, hey, they're scared of them. They're worried they're going to lose their rod because the rod's just sitting in there loose. And the problem is they were looking at it when the boat was just sitting there. When the boat was moving and the rods were being pressed by the wind, the rods were firm as can be, because it was just like you said, they had these points of contact. And when they were flexed, they weren't going anywhere. But when the boat was just sitting there, it was loose because it wasn't holding them tight. So I think it's kind of the same idea is, the rod wants to travel in plane, right? That's what it wants to do. And it's the person holding it that's going to take it out of plane. The rod wants to load and unload in a smooth way, but the person holding it screws that up. And that's why guys like Tim and I and ladies like yourself have jobs telling people to slow down and pay attention to, casting and playing.
Yeah, that's a really cool idea, April. I've never thought about that before. I'm definitely going to try that next time I go out.
Do you know what actually got me onto it? I'm just thinking about it now. It was in New Brunswick, fishing with my bob clay bamboo. And I noticed that it made a difference in my performance when I utilized my hand muscles.
Interesting.
And then from there, I came back, and obviously spending so much time in New Zealand, started applying it to single hand casting. But yeah, very interesting. And you're right, Brian, it's hard via audio, so I'll drop it for now, but I'd love to do some casting with you guys when I see you next.
About a couple of weeks ago, I recorded for Dave there, I think we called it a master class or something like that, but it's basically just talking about casting. And it's hard to explain to people how to spey cast better, just kind of looking at one screen. And, to me, when you think about casting, the big joints happen first, right? So whether we're spey casting or single handing, the cast starts at the feet. So that's the weight transfer. And, taking it all the way back to Spey-O-Rama, Tim, and this idea that most people are going to cast a pretty similar way, it's, in my view, it's if you're a right-handed person, you got that right foot forward, that blocks you from overturning. When you're back and you're rising into the firing position, your weight's on your left heel, you're going to come forward onto your right foot. The last thing you're going to do is utilize your hand or even specific muscles in your hand as you come forward. But to get to that point, you're going to, start with the feet, and then the hips come through and the shoulder comes through. Single handing, same deal. So it's big joints first, finishing with the little joints. And what you just described there, April, is taking it down to the smallest detail
joint,
of
right.
What part of your hand are you actually utilizing. And you can't start there and then try and throw the hip into it. That's not going to work, right? It's you got to have you got to have things in the right order.
That's really cool.
I want to go back to the Thompson. I mean, literally, I want to go back to the Thompson. But my intention when we started in the bucket was one day we're going to have a Thompson specific episode. I'm just going to put a few people together, that used to see on the river there all the time and talk about those days, because there's so many people that have gotten into steelhead fishing since the Thompson closed. And they've heard about it, or maybe they were spey fishing for years and just never made it there. And they're full of questions. And it's really tough to describe what it was like to be there to people that haven't been there, because it was so unique. I mean, steelheading everywhere is kind of unique, but it really was so unique. And it was such a gathering, a migration, like we said, of people at that time of year. It was the place to be, and everybody was there. And, you'd meet in the bar at the end of the day, and you had the people that stayed at the hilltop, and then you had the people that stayed at one of the hotels in town, and the people that camped at the Grease Hole, and, down at Shaw Springs and what have you, and people that like to fish down at Lytton. So if we do a Thompson episode, I'd love to try and involve you guys if you're interested, but let's talk real quick about, is there a path forward? And what we know about the Thompson is largely based on the test fishery at Albion. And for those that don't understand what I'm saying with this, test fisheries in this part of the world typically utilize a gill net. We catch and usually kill a few fish, and then we extrapolate those dead fish into a larger number of supposed fish that swam by and are now going to carry on merrily up the river. But the reality is steelhead don't necessarily travel in big groups. So it is possible for a test fishery to overestimate. It is possible for a test fishery to underestimate. And the angler effort is really a big part of enumeration. What I mean by that is the best way to know if there's fish in the river is to ask the people fishing. And I think we lost a couple of things with what we did on the Thompson. We lost let's call it the culture, the tradition, that migration, people showing up there every October and November. And we have also lost a scientific component of understanding how many fish are actually there. And it is entirely possible that we have had decent returns since the closure, and it's possible that we've had worse returns, right? Everything's just based on a test fishery and a little bit of spawner counts later on in the season. Of course, and I think this applies everywhere. When you take law-abiding anglers off the water, you open the doors for poaching. And when we have folks that get caught not following the rules, poaching per se, it's typically because law-abiding anglers reported them. Also, the mere presence of a law-abiding angler dissuades people from breaking the law. No one wants to get caught poaching, of course, hopefully. So I think, taking anglers off the Thompson didn't do the river any favors. Certainly the anglers have been gone long enough that if recreational fishing was the problem, we would have seen some type of rebound. My view was that instead of taking anglers off the water, we should have taken away their hooks. I believe it was Paul Beck that first made that suggestion, albeit probably in a joking way, but it resonated with me because I thought, if we had just said, hey, you can still fish the Thompson, you just can't use a hook. You can go out there and cast your long line, Tim, and skate your dry fly. And if there was a fish there, it'd probably come up and try and swallow that fly, and it would be no the worse for wear. And we'd have a pretty good idea if there were some fish around. And we would also keep that tradition of people going to the river. The town there would still benefit from, that migration, people staying in the hotels, hanging out in the bar, eating in the restaurants. And we would be in a better position to get back to having anglers there. And people would, I think, what we talked about a bit here today, Tim, is how, casting can kind of take over for hooking and landing fish, and that people who just love to fish don't really care about catching fish every day. And having folks out there casting dry flies with no hooks on might seem a little ridiculous to people who haven't done it, but I think I would still go and do that because I enjoy the camaraderie. So I'm kind of getting long-winded here, but if there was a hookless fishery there, am I out to lunch, or is that something you guys would find yourselves participating in?
I would go straight to the orchard and just breathe the smells and cast and be very happy. Personally, if it meant that was all I could have, I would still go. I wouldn't necessarily go for 2 months on end, but I would definitely take some time out of my year to do it for probably a week.
It's an important place. I mean, for me, it certainly shaped me as a person, as an angler. I'm not sure I would have the same interest in casting I would have if it wasn't for there. It was, the Thompson was special for so many reasons. The fish were part of it. But actually seeing so many people confined to such a small fishing area, you had a lot of big personalities in very, very, very close quarters, which led to some pretty legendary stories of things that went on. It was a place where the fish were as gnarly as the scenery. The wading was as gnarly as the fish. There was a lot of big personalities, egos, all trapped, having to eat in the same places, stay in the same places. You think about fishing the Bulkley or just in the Skeena region. I mean, in the Bulkley itself, you could be camped up at Aspen and never see your friend that's down fishing in Smithers. It's just such a long river with so many great areas, and the Thompson was so condensed. So, it's just a special place for a lot of reasons. I think, obviously, I would take anything I could get at this point, for sure. I think I'm same thing with you, April. I don't know if I'd be there for like an extended period of time, but I would surely make a visit. Yeah, and I think really the thing that bothers me about removing anglers from the river, you lose your advocacy. The first couple of years the river's closed, everyone's up in arms, right? There's a lot of stuff going on. There's petitions, there's pub nights, there's all kinds of things, but after a period of time, those things tend to stop. And we've lost out on a whole generation of potential advocates and potential warriors for a fishery like that because they've never been able to experience it. And I think it's really hard to value something like that by just hearing stories about it. I think the reason it's so special to us three is because we were there. We were there when that was happening, and you could fish, and that it gave a certain value and context to that entire experience. And I fear that without people being able to experience it in one way or another, these other user groups that negatively impact the fishery, they don't hear from us anymore. It's a tough one. I don't know. I mean, is there a way that you could, and I'm not a biologist and I'm not a expert on, regulatory changes, but if at one point there was enough fish that you could manage effort and manage encounter rate to the point where people could go and experience it without having an overly negative impact on the fish that are there, I think you could foster another generation of people who would value and love that fishery and really put it down for that place. And I hope that happens. And certainly, as I said, if they said that you could go and do that, I would probably do it. But what I would really like would to be to see some sort of amount of fish return that would allow for if nothing else, a highly regulated, highly restricted fishery that had a low encounter rate, but could convey the value of those fish, that place, that culture, that history to an up and coming group of younger anglers. I'm working at the shop. I'd worked at the shop long enough. There was a time I worked there where everyone who came in who was steelheading knew what a Thompson steelhead was, or that was an experience that was happening. That was a thing that was going on. What I've seen over the last, number of years since it's closed is you're seeing people come in that have no idea what that is. All they know is that there were fish there, it was closed, and that just doesn't exist anymore. So certainly it's a long-winded thing, and it's hard for me to speak short about that river because it just meant a lot to me. And it was the most unique steelhead fishery in social terms, in the way that you fished there. It was just unique in so many ways that it had a really big impact on me. And so when I speak on it, it's really hard for me to be short or I tend to drone on, right? But I would really like to see at some point to have some kind of fishery where we could introduce people who could potentially who could be amazing advocates for that river, to what made that river so special to our generation when we were able to fish it.
April, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I agree with Tim. I think that it's not doing anybody any good just sitting there. I think it would be a good reminder to people, going back to fishing without hooks on, which of course some people are going to roll their eyes at. That's great. Everyone's entitled to their own opinion. But I think for the few people that would be inspired by fishing with their hooks off, it would be a reminder as to what could happen to other fisheries if we don't stay on top of them and, like you said, have advocacy towards them. So
at the end of the day, I just think anglers are the ones we care about fish. If we don't have anglers endeared to these fisheries, then it can be tough for sure. It's hard to, they represent our stakeholdership in those sort of things. So when they take us off, I think it's a net negative for the fish myself, but that's where I'm at.
Because here's the question. Okay, so say we constantly bring up the Thompson. I bring it up on my show. Brian, you bring it up all the time. We all bring it up. We were at Catherine's wedding recently, and that was the common conversation, was the Thompson. So the question to me that I have is, does the Thompson without anybody on it teach more lessons than having some people on it without a hook? Which one is going to have more of a positive impact? And I can't help but think people who can experience it without a hook would there'd be more lessons in that way. I
agree for sure. If that's what we could have to have people experience it, then I think we would take that. We would definitely take that.
Because right now, Adelaide and Charles don't even know what it is, right? They've never been on it. Charles wants to experience it, but it's not a major conversation in this house. But if I took them there for a week every year, it would suddenly be a part of our conversation. And is that not, even that little bit of conversation, is that not better than nothing at all? I think it is.
Well, I think that we could do a whole show specific to the Thompson. But, once again, Tim, your idea of heavy regulation. So if hookless is the extreme end of that, then what is along the way that hasn't really been, put into place? So one thing that, I find myself discussing with people quite a bit is this idea of catch and release limits. It's not an original idea. They do it in other parts of the world, other parts of our country. It's largely viewed as a successful management tool, albeit one that's hard to police from a legal standpoint. It becomes a bit of a cultural one where, it just, with our own business here, guiding on the Skeena, what I've noticed is if someone catches a really good fish and they reel up after that and they're just like, hey, that's as good as it gets for me today. I want to savor this moment. I'm just going to ride out the rest of the day hanging out in the boat. And when they get back to the beach, back to the dock, and they walk into the lodge and the last thing they did was reel in a fish, then I don't want to say that they have a lot of attention. That's not the motivation, but everyone thinks this is pretty neat. But the next day when they go back out there, they are fishing with so much confidence, way more confidence than if they'd flogged away for another 2 hours without getting a bite. So I think there's something really cool about catching a fish and calling it good, one and done, if you will. And if the Thompson was to ever reopen, it would need these type of protections because there would be a lot of interest. I'm going down the road with it now, but we could talk about a lottery system. You hate to have a situation where it only becomes something for the highest bidder, but at the same time too, there is some value in getting as much money in place as possible when it comes to, habitat protections and such, and dealing with politicians who want to understand how many jobs are tied to these things. So I think, let's keep the conversation going. It's probably only a matter of time till we see that Albion test net, with enough fish in it that suggests the river should be reopened. But when it does get reopened, what's that going to look like? Because everybody's going to want to go. So we do need to have a plan in place. And ultimately, the rainbow trout fishery there is healthy, anecdotally, from anyone I know that goes there, despite, how many people are participating. And from a science standpoint, we know that those rainbow trout can choose to outmigrate. So we know that there are things condition-wise in the river that can, control whether a fish decides to smolt and outmigrate to the ocean and come back, or if it wants to stay and live as a residential trout. And one of those things is the supply of food. And what the three of us know from experience being there is one of the things about the Thompson that sets it apart from your typical Steelhead River is the amount of food in the river. It's, there's a lot of groceries there for those fish. So for the rainbow trout there that choose to not outmigrate, that do stay in the river, they do exceptionally well. So I am an optimist by trade. I think all of us who are fishing guides probably are. But, I do believe that there will be a time when the Albion test net suggests that there's a decent number of fish and we do get anglers back out there. And like you say, Tim, I hope it doesn't skip too many generations before this happens.
Just as far as the limiting ourselves to our catch, because we did that this year or last year on the Bulkley, obviously as a family, because the fishing was, I don't want to jinx anything for this year, but the fishing was great. And there were very few people on the river. And so that's exactly what we did. We had a limitation on how many fish we could each catch. And we loved it because, to be fair, we have a 6-year-old, so we didn't go out super early. We were going out midday. And then I would catch my fish or he would catch his fish. She would catch her fish. I mean, Natalie got her first steelhead this or last fall. But then you would devote your time to supporting the other person. So there was a lot of just camaraderie, which can, be missing when everyone's out to get that fish for the day or get as many fish as they can for the day. So we personally did do the self-limitation or the self-policing, and it really enhanced our experience. So I know it's not for everybody, and you get the argument of coming around the world. I mean, Charles came in from Australia. That's around the world. And it's still enhanced our experience compared to just being so focused on getting as many fish as you can.
No, I couldn't agree more. And, last year we had the same thing on Lower Skeena. We had surprisingly good fishing compared to what the Thai test net was suggesting was swimming by. So yeah, it is what it is. And, ultimately the best way to limit your impact is to catch less fish. So this ties in with my wind up question for you both. And I'll give it to you both at the same time here, and you can each answer, and we'll start with you, April. For someone who hasn't done this before, and maybe they've just purchased a spey rod, or maybe they're thinking of purchasing a spey rod, I'm looking for two things. I'm looking for a casting tip. They don't have access to an instructor. They're just out there trying to figure it out off of YouTube themselves or listening to a podcast like this one. I want your number one tip for, how they can set themselves on a path to success from a casting standpoint. And then I'm also looking for one that has to do with the mindset of a steelheader. And I get it. It's a journey. Not everyone starts there. But Tim, one of the things you are known for is a guy who would get in his car and drive 2 hours to go fish for the day and then drive back. You're willing to put the effort in. April, even though you're on the other side of the world, you still maintain a place here. So obviously steelheading is important. So first off is the casting tip. Second off is, for someone getting into it, who hasn't caught a steelhead yet, what should their mindset be? Because, as a guide, I see it all the time where, some people are just fish magnets. Other people can't find a fish. Mentally, where should you be to allow the fish to come to you? So April, you're first.
Oh, Brian, you're throwing that on me. Tim, why can't you go first? No, just kidding. A tip, a casting tip specifically, listen to the sounds you're making. If you're hearing if you're hearing the line stick behind you, maybe you need to figure out why. Listen to the snaps listen to the wind. Just listen, open your ears up, and analyze from there. And obviously that could be it could be myriad of reasons as to what could be going wrong. And 2, the mindset. Wow. It's not about the fish. I know that's cliche. It's not about the fish. And I can only speak on when it comes to mindset and emotions and psychology on my own experiences. Use it as an opportunity to ground yourself with what's going on around you. And that even ties into the casting tip with listening. Use it as an opportunity to meditate, be aware, relax, slow down. And then usually a fish will find you.
All right, Tim, you're up.
Oh boy. One casting tip. I'd have to say be smooth, I guess would be, avoid jerky, fast movements, be deliberate, be smooth, be thoughtful, take your time, be smooth. Yeah, I mean, that would be an overriding thing that I think can help you in any stage of any spey cast, is to be smooth, be incremental with your speed, be incremental with your force. That's probably my best tip. As far as the mindset of steelhead fishing, for me, it's just it's a way to be ultra present. That's how I would look at it. For someone else is just be enveloped. Enjoy being part of what you see in front of you. Just for me, it's meditative, as April kind of said. Like, I like the big landscapes because I think they make me feel really insignificant. They make my presentness in that moment even more extreme because you feel dwarfed by the landscape around you. The Thompson was really good for that. The Upper Squamish can be the same way, the way these huge mountains rise and they're covered and you just feel like an ant, right? And I love that feeling of, if you've ever done any like sort of distance running, you need to get into this place where you're just focusing on your breathing, right? And so in order to continue to run, for me anyway, when I did run, and certainly I don't look like I have in a very long time, but, lifting weights can be another one. It's hard to think about life's problems when you've got 60-pound dumbbells over your head. You have to be present. And so steelheading for me, the places it's brought me, the mindset that it's there is I'm getting an opportunity to step into, to be present in nature and not be focused on any one particular thing. And it does tend to be meditative to me. So I would just say, be present, just let it flow. And that tends to be, for me anyway, when I get surprised with a fish is when I feel most part of everything, right? So it's just be part of it. Don't fight that. That's the neatest thing, and it's really cool stepping into a river because you're literally feeling the current push on your legs. You're actually becoming a part of the whole thing. So for me, the mindset, it's just be present, enjoy, be part of it.
Excellent. Well, on that note, I'd like to thank you both for joining me today. This has been a ton of fun, and we hope to have you back. And for our listeners, I would encourage you to check out our website. That's inthebucket.com or inthebucketpodcast.com. And I will manage to put some photos and maybe a video or two up to supplement our discussion here. And once again, Tim, April, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Great to see you guys.
Likewise.
Well, folks, that's our show for today. Once again, I want to thank April and Tim for joining me. To the listener, we appreciate you tuning in. If you haven't done so already, please check out www.inthebucketpodcast.com, where you'll find show notes for all of our episodes, as well as contact info for our guests. If you're on Instagram, you can find us at inthebucketpodcast. If you need some help with your spey casting, and you want to fish together in Skeena country this summer, you can also learn about the Wet Fly Swing, School of Fishing, Steelhead Spey School at our lodge on the Skeena this August. Until then, I look forward to bringing you our next episode of In the Bucket, when I'll be speaking with pro guide Stevie Morrow from Epic Waters in Smithers, BC, and fly fishing travel expert Justin Miller from the Fly Shop in Redding, California. If you have any questions or comments about our show, or just want to talk fishing, please feel free to shoot me an email at info@skeenaspey.com. Thanks for listening.